Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Grimes.
So thank you. I hope that I'll live up to the introduction. I realize that this is not the sexiest title, but I will try to make the talk both intelligible and interesting. To be honest, I've never given a talk at University of Michigan. I've been out here a couple times because my wife's grandparents lived here. My wife's grandfather was a professor of sociology many years ago. So I'm a little intimidated by being at University of Michigan, which is one of the great centers of Japanese studies in the world, and certainly in the United States. And so I thought I should come up with something very sober sounding. But I realized that probably people at the University of Michigan are pretty similar to people everywhere else, and maybe I could have come up with something better for the organizers. But as I said, I think I'll try to make this intelligible and interesting, and I hope that I'll also make clear to you that some of this stuff is actually quite important. So without further ado, let me just talk a little bit about what's going on. So the book that Professor Tsutsui mentioned, which is on regionalism, financial regionalism in East Asia, basically tells the story about how after the Asian financial crisis, there's a series of efforts by the ASEAN plus 3 countries, that's Southeast Asian Association of Southeast Asian Nations plus China, Japan, Korea, to try to learn from the lessons of the Asian financial crisis and create an institutional structure to address, prevent, and manage future financial crises. And that was what the book looked at various aspects of this. The most developed of it is something called the Chiang Mai Initiative, which is the regional liquidity arrangement, and I'll define what that is in just a moment. And the book came out at the very end of 2008, which means that it was finished before the financial crisis, although I had a pretty good inkling that there was something big coming down the road, but nobody knew quite exactly how big. And I tried to hedge it some in the book. But you know, if you write something and you spend 10 years of your life on something, thinking about a set of institutional arrangements that are meant to that are created in order to deal with financial crises, and then you get the greatest financial crisis the world has seen in 70 years. It's sort of the time to look back and say, okay, what did I get right? What did I not get right? And what lessons? What has come out of this? And so I'm not going to bore you with the sort of what did I get right? What did other people get right? Although I will say I got most of it right, even though it didn't look for a while like I was going to. But as a political scientist, I was trained to be cynical, and that usually works pretty well in moving forward. Okay, so I'll discuss briefly what the Chiang Mai Initiative is, what it's meant to do, how it works. We will talk about the effects of the global financial crisis on East Asia, and more broadly, some of the lessons that are learned. And of course, some of the lessons are things that are local to East Asia, but many of them are not. And we will end up talking a little bit about the Eurozone crisis, which is one of those crises that just keeps on giving for a variety of reasons that you guys are all aware of. Okay, so the Chiang Mai Initiative is named after the city in Thailand at which the agreement was made. And basically what it is a mutual insurance network, right? If a country gets into a currency crisis and is unable to borrow the money it needs or have the money it needs in order to back its currency, typically what it needs is liquidity. And liquidity is just another term for money. Liquid money, ready money, money that can be thrown into defending the currency immediately. And so we do have a global regime for doing this. It's called the IMF. You may recall in 1997 that the Asian financial crisis was so big that it was too big for the IMF on its own. And so all of the 3 major bailouts in East Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, all were multilateral events led by the IMF. So what the Chiang Mai Initiative does is it puts in place a network of by which money can be thrown at the problem. Now, there's a problem, okay, and it looks like this, or it looked like this initially. You'll sometimes see it looking a little different, but I like it looks like a yurt to me, and I like yurts. But basically, you have a series of bilateral agreements. They're called swap agreements, bilateral swap agreements that obligate one country to provide funds, and funds in this sense means dollars, under certain circumstances to a country that has a currency crisis. Okay, and it's a network, and we don't have to go into the numbers. This was the last iteration before what's known as multilateralization of Chiang Mai. But in any event, I'll show you that picture in a moment. Okay, so the basic problem though is when you're providing up to 80 billion or more. I mean, this is not small amounts of money. And the number 87.5 billion is kind of jury-rigged. No economy in this system would have gotten more than, I think the highest number was about 17 billion for Korea. But you sort of add up all of these things, and they go in both directions. So, I mean, we all know that Thailand is not going to bail out Japan. But you add it all up and you come up with this number. The problem of providing large amounts of money is that you want it back, right? Now, in the Asian financial crisis, I think the Japanese had it entirely right. They were arguing from early in, this is not a problem of fundamental solvency. If you throw money at the problem, we can resolve the problems after. We can resolve the structural problems after. But basically, they've run out of cash. They're not fundamentally bankrupt. And that probably would have been the right thing at the time. But the problem of setting up institutions like that is that it creates perverse incentives. In economics, you'd call it moral hazard. So if you know that I will bail you out if you get into trouble because it's painful to me, painful for my economy, it may make you act a little bit less responsibly. And my students quickly understand this when I point out this is like having your parents co-sign the loan. They never believed that they would be irresponsible, but the fact is they would be. So the basic problem of any sort of liquidity arrangement is that you have to have both credibility, that the money will go there, and credibility that if you misbehave, if you bring this on yourself, the money will not, or that it will come with strict conditions. Okay? And so in the term of art in economics and politics would be monitoring and enforcement. You have to have some means of monitoring the behavior of these countries beforehand to say they're acting responsibly or they're acting irresponsibly. And then if you say if they're acting responsibly and they get whacked by a crisis, then you have some sort of obligation to provide the money. If they're acting irresponsibly, then you don't. Right, and that's how you build some level of enforcement into the system. Now, when the Asian financial crisis, I'm sorry, the AFC stands for Asian Financial Crisis. I use a few of these acronyms just for space purposes. At the time, you may remember there was a lot of discussion about a proposal that the Japanese government put forward in the very end of the summer of 1997, in the midst of the crisis, for something called the Asian Monetary Fund, which was never very well fleshed out. It was not exactly the way you're supposed to release a proposal. You're supposed to actually have a proposal when you release it, and talk to people beforehand. But that had to do with several personalities. But we think that it was basically a $100 billion fund, about half of which was to be provided by Japan. I think the Taiwanese kind of liked this because they were willing to throw in money, and they probably would have been able to join the club, and that it would provide large amounts of liquidity quickly without conditions, in the expectation that you fix the problem after. You throw the money in, you fix the problem after. There's an argument that this builds out as something called the politics of resentment. That's a phrase that's associated with a guy named Richard Higgett, but there's a lot of other people who've written on that. And the idea that within East Asia there comes to be a sense that the United States and the IMF are not on their side. And I think this is not a bad observation. And it motivates the idea we should have a local fund. Okay? Now, the problem is that how do you put in conditions, or what the IMF in its own jargon calls conditionality. Conditionality just means attaching conditions. It's one of those horrible words that's widely used, like functionality, which is a function, right? So the basic problem is, now how do these countries address this issue? Because this is a small club, right? To say to a state whose economy is in free fall, we're not helping you out, is a very profoundly dangerous thing to do if you want to stay friends, right? It's not a very pleasant thing to do. So what they do is you need to set up some sort of automatic means of doing this. For want of a better thing to do, they set up something called the IMF link, which said that only 10% of the funds, later 20%, could be released without the IMF saying they could be released. So in other words, despite the politics of resentment, despite the clear feeling that this is an alternative to the IMF, the way that the problem of credibility is solved is to make the IMF do it. Now, there are some other interesting stories that we can surround it, but I'm not going to play with that right now. But it's meant to address these basic problems that we, all of which sort of fall into how do you get people to act responsibly in the present in order so that you don't have to pay for them in the future. Okay, and none of these terms needs much more explanation than that. I shouldn't think. This is quite different, though, from the Asian Monetary Fund concept, which called for regional monitoring and what I call ex-ante conditionality, which is that you're told beforehand, okay, you're behaving properly, so you will be bailed out. Ex-post conditionality is putting these nasty IMF conditions on. If you want your money, then you're going to need to cut government spending by X, Y, or Z. Okay? I end up shorthanding. Nobody talks about the Asian Monetary Fund anymore as a sort of ideal, but we still use this as a shorthand for this sort of very regional fund clipping the tie to the IMF. Okay, so this is essentially where my book ended, and then we get the financial crisis. And one of the first things that the East Asian countries do is they do what's called multilateralization. So now CMI becomes CMIM, and rather than being a network, you have, I don't know if I need this, I'm pretty loud anyway. You have a set of, a notional pool, a reserve pool, in which everybody has shares. And it looks a lot like the IMF, where you have voting shares, you have, it doesn't link up exactly in the same way, where you have amounts that you're allowed to draw, and we could go through it in greater detail if you're interested, but I suspect that we don't need to go there. And it is the notion of two key things that gets the advocates of an Asian Monetary Fund style thing very excited. One is it's a reserve pool. Two is it has voting. Okay? Consensus for rulemaking, but in a crisis, in theory, funds are only dispersed. Oh, wait, excuse me. Let me put it. Funds are dispersed if and only if you have a weighted majority vote in favor of it. So countries are obligated, in theory, and the money won't be released if not. Okay. So the one thing I should note, though, before we leave this is that be careful of words. I think you're all aware of this. The reserve pool is not centrally managed. The reserve pool is simply a promise that we will provide X amount of money. There are outs for not providing money, and most importantly, the IMF link remains in place despite this majority voting thing. In fact, that's the majority vote thing actually adds an additional layer of uncertainty the process because the IMF link is already there. Now, the idea is that over time you create some other mechanism. And that would be something called the ASEAN Monetary Research Organization, which has finally been set up in Singapore a couple of years after it was supposed to be. Okay, so let's change tracks and look at the global crisis. So first off, again, a little bit of unnecessary abbreviation. The global financial crisis is not equal to the Asian financial crisis. When you look at the way in which the global financial crisis affected Asia, which it did, right, and Japan perhaps most of all, but it doesn't affect Asia through financial channels. Right? There is no currency crisis in Asia that comes out of the Asian financial crisis. Instead, it's trade effects. It's because you have such bad effects in the United States and Europe that these countries that are very dependent on trade, on exports to those countries, end up being very badly hit, at least in the short run. But so you don't have the same sort of contagion issues. And so we don't get to test whether Chiang Mai works or not. That's a good thing, but it's a little frustrating, for me. In fact, why not? Well, basically, it's what I call self-help, and again, self-help for international relations people is a little different from self-help in your local bookstore. It doesn't have to do with self-improvement. It doesn't have to do with decluttering your office. This has to do with the fact that you don't trust your neighbors and the international regimes to help you out. And so you insure yourself. You take care of yourself. Exchange rates have adjusted. You've seen a shift towards flexible exchange rates. For those of you who aren't clear about what I'm talking about, it's not really that important to my talk. You see the accumulation of massive foreign exchange reserves. I'll get back to that in just a moment. Financial institutions are better supervised. So if you look at Thailand or Indonesia or even Korea, you had a massive failure of financial supervision that allowed for the contagion to be much worse. It actually looks a little more similar to the United States and parts of Europe than it does to the Asian countries this time around. There's not a single major East Asian financial institution of which I am aware that went under. And we can come up with lots here and in Europe. And that has to do with supervision. And these countries were very responsible macroeconomically. They all were able, fiscal slack means basically they were able to borrow a lot of money and nobody freaked out. And so they were able to address the problem with effective fiscal stimulus. And every single East Asian economy down to Vietnam and Cambodia had a massive fiscal stimulus. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this foreign exchange reserves, because everybody's aware of China with its $3 trillion in reserves. And probably everybody in this room is aware that Japan has very high reserves. And everything else looks really small on this graph, unfortunately. But if you look at the purple line, it's kind of amazing. These countries are holding in foreign exchange reserves the equivalent of, take Singapore out because Singapore is different, 20 to 60% of their annual gross domestic product is being just held in the form of mostly dollar exchange, foreign exchange reserves. That is a very large insurance policy. It's related to some other things, especially with China. I don't think China needs $3 trillion in insurance. But even Indonesia and the Philippines, we're seeing quite high levels of foreign exchange reserve holdings. If you have that kind of foreign exchange reserves, you don't need a bailout. Right? It's a very expensive form of insurance because they're sitting here holding, earning under 2%. I don't know what the percentage right now is on short-term bond holdings, but probably if you figure the average maturity, it's got to be under 2% that they're earning on U.S. dollar holdings, plus the dollar's depreciating compared to their currencies. It's very expensive compared to what they could be using for other purposes. But it did prevent the crisis contagion. It also contributed to the cause of the crisis, which is another problem. Okay, so I come to this question of do we move towards a regional solution? I've already sort of semi-dismissed the idea of reserve pooling. There is a contractual agreement, but who enforces contracts at the international level? Your reputation does, but we'll see, right? There are problems of credibility. There's problems of thinking about this as a single unit. We talked a little bit about procedure. You have procedures, you have voting shares. It's much cleaner. There's a whole system by which the money gets dispersed, but the IMF link persists. And the question is, how do you get away from that? And the answer is, well, you need to have monitoring and enforcement. We have two forms of Japanese. Most people will raise their hand on Japanese. Okay? So in other words, if you don't believe that these people are independent, neither does anybody else. And there's a reason, right? Because they're not going to be. If they're not independent of their home governments, then the whole point of having this organization, which is to take away the blame in case the countries have to turn down another country, is lost. If you're still feeling idealistic, let me just tell you about the delay in AMRO's establishment, which was that there was a fight between China and Japan about whether a Japanese or a Chinese would direct this thing. Now, if we care so much about who's going to direct the organization, it must matter, you would think. By the way, does anybody know what the compromise was? It's a 3-year initial term, and following the brilliance of the ECB, they split it. So the first year is a Chinese gentleman from the People's Bank of China. What's his name? I'm blanking on the name. I'm sorry. And the next 2 years will be a very capable guy from the Ministry of Finance named Nemoto. So those are the problems, right? And by the way, we don't know what standards they would use. How do you know? I asked this of somebody who I can't say who it was, but it was somebody who had decision-making power in the Bank of the Ministry of Finance on this Japanese Ministry of Finance, and he said, "You can't have two different standards between AMRO and the IMF." In that case, what is AMRO doing? We shall see. We don't know. Okay, so lessons of the crisis. So looking at the crisis, there is one place in Asia where things looked really giddy-giddy for a moment, and that was Korea in the fall of 2008. It's not exactly clear why, insofar as Korea was actually not notionally holding $200 billion in foreign exchange reserves. And the solution to the Korean problem ended up being a $30 billion swap line with the U.S. Federal Reserve. But what we see, it's a crisis of confidence, despite the size of these foreign exchange reserves. Chiang Mai is completely inadequate to the problem because, for one thing, Korea couldn't have gotten enough money out of Chiang Mai. For another thing, Chiang Mai is linked to an IMF bailout plan. Korea can't be going to the IMF. I mean, it's so disruptive of a highly internationalized, highly developed economy. And really, there's no fundamental crisis going on at all. And they don't even go they don't even go first to China and Japan. You'll hear some post hoc stories about, they consulted first with the Japanese Ministry of Finance. I have my doubts, right? And so do my friends in the U.S. Treasury. So basically, how do you create a rapid response facility for this amount of money without reopening those basic questions of, look, the answer for Korea is anybody should have been willing to lend Korea money because it was obvious that Korea was purely in a brief liquidity situation. There was nothing wrong with Korea. And anybody would have been. But how do you set up an institution that does that without reopening these questions? I mean, you can set up a rapid response system, and that's part of the discussion that's going on. But then who do you exclude? Do you exclude Malaysia? I'm willing to throw in Malaysia. How about Thailand? What happens when the Philippines has a problem? It reopens all of these questions that they didn't want to open in the first place. And one of the basic problems, and I'll get back to this in a moment, is that you need leadership on this one. You need somebody who's willing to take the heat and be the main part of the money. And it's easy to know where that is. It's China and Japan. It's just hard to see how they work together to take the heat, or how they predictably work together, which is essential to the whole story, because if you don't have credibility, if you don't have predictability, you do not have an effective liquidity arrangement. Now, I promised I would mention Europe, or threatened, and I am. Greece raises all sorts of new questions. It shows you macroeconomic policy coordination is always difficult, even in what is unarguably the world's most intricate, developed, supranational body in history, with rules, clear punishments written in, firewalls and everything. Even here, Greece not only cheats and isn't detected, but even without the cheating, they were violating every limit every single year since their introduction into the euro, with the exception of 1 year, in which year they only violated one major limit. Okay? Domestic politics trumps. The Greek governments did what they needed to do, or what they felt they needed to do, in order to stay in power. And it has caused a puncture in the balloon of the euro that may or may not be fixable. And the IMF has returned to Western Europe with a vengeance. And this says a little something about a very much less institutionalized place like East Asia. Now, I just like this picture. It's a little hard to see with the lights, but you can see Angela Merkel is looking very stern and making a point to, this is Prime Minister Papandreou of Greece. I just sort of like the picture, because it reminds you of the problem that arises again of somebody having to take the leadership and crack the whip. Now, for my money, I think Germany is sort of doing a little too much cracking and a little bit less, and not necessarily acting in its own interest. But we have this situation in which Europe has, what are Europe's choices? I mean, is Greece going to leave the euro? And then what happens to the next dominoes of Italy, Portugal, Greece, Spain? I don't want to say Ireland. It's it's the country of my ancestors. Maybe Ireland. But there's the creation of a European Financial Stability Fund, which will have the same problems of enforcement. There's the creation of what's called the Pact for the Euro, which modernizes the Stability and Growth Pact, and creates more penalties for misbehavior that may actually be enforced. We don't know. What are the mechanisms that ensure enforcement? You can always write a good law, but for somebody, from my perspective, the question is, who puts in the power? Who's willing to crack the whip? The other option is what's called fiscal federalism, which is Eurobonds, having the Eurozone as a whole, or Eurozone bonds, excuse me, having the Eurozone as a whole issue bonds which can then be lent out to the countries in question, which is a means of putting more of the costs on Germany and the Netherlands and Finland and a few others, and is therefore not attractive to those countries. It creates all sorts of moral hazard. It may be what they have to do, but it is a profound political step. And as I put here, the view, when you look at this from Beijing and Tokyo, you're staring into just an abyss. It looks like an endless hole, as long as you bring it home. But if you don't bring it home, it doesn't look as bad. Okay, so we're left with, this is the last slide, the dilemmas of regionalism. First off, my take home is that all the institutionalization and planning in the world can't eliminate the politics. And in this case, if we can't separate monitoring from preferences of governments, you can't guarantee effective crisis management. And even in the euro, it didn't work. So where does the politics line up correctly? And here the core issues remain. Japan and China, they do absolutely have common economic interests in this set, as they're the big creditors, they'd be the big lenders. They have a common interest in the health of their neighbors, with whom they are so closely tied in regional production networks and all sorts of other ways, and have political goals as well. But their political goals may well diverge, and I don't think I need to justify this statement. And if they do diverge, then unpredictability seeps in. And if you have unpredictability, you don't have credibility. Kindleberger, since I'm talking about issues actually that are quite large in the international monetary system, I have to call upon the great Charles Kindleberger, who was an economist who wrote beautifully. I know it sounds like a contradiction, but it's true. You should read some Kindleberger sometime. He called it leadership. And he said, somebody needs to take the heat. Somebody needs to be willing to provide the public good of both provision and enforcement. And right now there is such a place, and it's called the U.S. Federal Reserve. That may not be the case forever. And so my prediction on the East Asian side with regard to the liquidity arrangements and how you deal with and try to prevent crises is that ad hoc self-help will prevail, which takes us right back to, let's see, hold on. No, I don't want ink color. Sorry, I'm not familiar with this particular, yeah, takes us back to there. And then I think, whoops, we can end. Thank you.